That night, the sky over France was swallowed by a darkness so dense it felt as though even the stars were afraid to appear. Wind moved through the ancient forests, carrying the damp scent of cold earth and rotting leaves wrapping itself around the stone road that climbed toward an old fortress on the hill. This was not the road of invading armies, nor was it the path of soldiers marching to war. And yet, in the blackness, torches flared to life, one by one, forming a trembling ribbon of light that crept silently upward. The men carrying the torches did not speak. The only sounds were the heavy thud of leather boots on wet stone and the faint clink of metal with each step. They wore armor, but they carried none of the fire of warriors. Walking beside them were figures draped in the black robes of the church, their faces hidden beneath deep hoods, hands clenched tightly around crosses, as if even they were uncertain of what awaited them beyond the gate. The castle emerged from the darkness, towering motionless. Walls that had once witnessed feasts, triumphs, and absolute power now stood cold and silent. There was no trumpet call, no guards rushing to defend it. The gate was pushed open with a long, tortured groan of ancient wood and iron. The sound echoed through the night like a sentence already passed. Inside, the corridors stretched endlessly. Torchlight danced across stone walls, shadows flickering and twisting. The air smelled of dampness, smoke, melted wax, and something else, something harder to name, like the weight of time itself sealed into the stone over countless years. The footsteps grew faster, more deliberate. This was no inspection. This was a hunt. They moved with purpose, as though they knew exactly where they were going, past empty chambers, past heavy wooden doors, until they reached a great hall. There in the firelight stood a man. He did not run. He did not shout. He showed no sign of surprise. He stood straight, hands loosely folded before him, calm to the point of chill, as if he had been waiting for them all along. The torchlight revealed his face in fragments. This was not the face of a thief cornered in desperation, nor the terror of a man about to be seized. There was pride there, weariness, and something harder to describe, the bearing of someone accustomed to giving orders, not receiving them. A cleric stepped forward. His voice was low but precise as he read the charges framed in the cold language of law and faith. The words echoed through the empty hall, bouncing off stone walls, sounding less like accusations and more like a verdict long decided. The man listened. He did not interrupt. He did not protest. Only when the final words fell into silence did he draw a slow breath, measured, controlled, like a warrior preparing to enter the final battle of his life. There were no hurried chains, no struggle. Soldiers stepped in on either side and gestured. The man turned his head, looking once more around the great hall. His eyes passed over the walls, the symbols of authority, the remnants of a life lived at the very summit of power. For a moment, no one spoke. Even the wind seemed to pause. As they led him out of the castle, torchlight stretched his shadow across the stone floor, long distorted, flickering like a ghost. The procession moved away, leaving the fortress behind, silent once more, sinking back into darkness, as if it too were holding its breath for what was to come. Who was this man? What had he done to force the church and the crown to act together on a freezing winter night like this? What could turn a castle, once synonymous with honor, into a place surrounded like the lair of a monster? The answer is not simple, because the man taken that night was not an enemy of France. He was not a rebel lord. He was not a defeated general. Until that moment, his name had been spoken with respect. He had stood on battlefields amid the roar of soldiers and the cheers of the people. He had fought for the crown, for faith, and for the honor of an entire nation. He had stood beside Joan of Arc, and that is what makes this arrest more terrifying than any monster tale, because if a man once hailed as a hero could be pulled from his own castle in silence beneath the shaking torchlight of soldiers and priests, then the question is no longer just, what did he do? The question becomes, what happened to him in the years when no one was watching? That night did not merely mark the fall of a man. It opened one of the darkest and most contested chapters in French history, a story that centuries later still refuses to offer clear answers. And to understand how a hero could come to be called a monster, we must go far back in time, back to the name, the bloodline, and the world that shaped him. And because of that, before we turn back the clock to search for answers, there is one thing I want to ask you right now. If you believe that the darkest chapters of history should not be buried beneath layers of dust and silence, if you believe that humanity's past is shaped not only by glorious victories, but also by secrets, mistakes, and shadows deliberately forgotten, if you believe that some truths are never purely black or white, but always exist somewhere between history and legend, then you are in the right place. Stories like these are not always easy to hear. They unsettle us. They make us question what we think we know. Sometimes they force us to look again at how history itself is written. But that is exactly why they deserve to be told. And if you want us to keep opening doors into the darkest corridors of the past, take a moment to like this video. It's a small action, but it tells us that these forgotten stories still have an audience willing to listen. If you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe now. Every day we'd step together into chapters of history where the light does not reach, where real people left behind traces so disturbing they still send chills through the world today. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a journey when the gate to the darkness opens once again. Tonight, we are not simply telling the story of a man who was accused. We will not rush to label someone a monster, nor will we easily crown someone a victim. What lies before you is a journey through power, war, faith, and fear. A story where historical fact blends with rumor, where confessions may be born of belief of pressure or of a private hell inside the human mind. The man taken away in the cold of that night bore a name that once filled France with pride. But that name did not become a symbol by accident. It was forged through blood ambition and a world where power granted too early can twist an entire life. And to understand how a hero can stand on the thin line between light and darkness, we must begin where everything started. We must go back many years before that fateful night. Back to a powerful family. Back to a child born already destined to rule. Back to the name de Rais. The name de Rais was not ordinary. In medieval France, it was more than a family title. It was a declaration of power, of wealth, and of a position so deeply entrenched in the social order that it was almost untouchable. The de Rais family stood among the richest and most powerful lineages in France. Their wealth was not the kind accumulated by merchants counting coins from trade routes. It was measured in land, in castles and forests, in villages scattered across vast fields, where thousands of people were born, worked, and died under the rule of that name. In those territories, the king's law was distant. The law that truly governed daily life was the will of the de Rais family. Castles bearing the de Rais crest rose like stone fortresses across the countryside. They were not merely residences, they were symbols. Thick walls towering keeps deep moats. Each structure was designed to remind those living below that power was always present, always watching. Every castle functioned as a miniature seat of rule, where orders were issued, taxes were collected, and punishments were carried out with little need for interference from any higher authority. Alongside the land came soldiers. The de Rais family held the right to raise and command their own armed men. Warriors in armor marked with the family insignia, loyal not to the crown, but to their lord. In that era, possessing a private army meant holding life and death power. It allowed the de Rais to defend their territory, but it also allowed them to impose their will on anyone who dared resist. For the peasants living on de Rais land, the name was both shield and blade. The family protected them from bandits from war spilling into their villages, but the price was absolute obedience. Heavy taxes, forced labor, and near total dependence on their lord were simply facts of life. A complaint spoken too loudly, a glance deemed disrespectful could lead to consequences no one wished to describe aloud. In that world, the name de Rais carried a clear meaning. it meant inherited power. It meant being born above others while everyone else was born beneath you. Not because you were wiser or more virtuous, but simply because the blood in your veins was the correct blood. It was a world where inequality did not need to be hidden because it was believed to be the natural order ordained by God. It was into this world that Gilles de Rais was born. From childhood, he did not belong to the many. He grew up in vast stone chambers beneath soaring ceilings where footsteps echoed and silence could be more unsettling than screams. He was surrounded by servant soldiers and men who bowed their heads as he passed. But being surrounded did not mean being close. It created an invisible distance, a wall separating him from the rest of the world. For a child born into absolute power, one thing happens easily. The line between right and wrong begins to blur. When every desire can be fulfilled, when no one dares say no, the idea of limits slowly disappears. Power in that case does not need to be learned. It simply exists, like air, like breath. The de Rais family gave Gilles more than wealth and status. They gave him a quiet but dangerous belief that he was born to rule, that the world existed to serve people like him, and in a society where faith and power were fused, that belief was rarely challenged. Peasants who saw Gilles as a child likely bowed with the same mixture of fear and reverence they would show him as an adult. To them, there was no difference between the boy and the Lord. The name de Rais defined everything. It covered the human being beneath turning a child of flesh and blood into a living symbol of authority. Here the first seed of tragedy was planted, not in an act of violence, not in a single wrong decision, but in an environment where power had no counterweight, where wealth and status were not balanced by responsibility or restraint. A world where no one prepared a child to face failure loss or the boundaries of the self. The name de Rais opened every door for Gilles, but it also closed many others. It robbed him of the chance to live as an ordinary human being, to learn how to make mistakes without paying with his soul. And when a person grows up, having never learned how to be denied, one day the world itself becomes the one that pays the price. To understand Gilles de Rais, we cannot look only at what he would later be accused of. We must look at the world that created him, a world where absolute power ruled not only the land, but also quietly shaped the mind. And that story, that tragedy, was only just beginning. If power surrounded Gilles de Rais from the moment he was born, then loneliness was what truly raised him in his earliest years. Despite being born into immense wealth and surrounded by dozens of servants, Gilles grew up without the one thing a child needs most, the presence of his parents. Gilles' father died when he was still very young. His mother pulled away by political calculations, and family obligations soon vanished from her son's daily life as well. This loss did not arrive as a loud, dramatic tragedy. No wails were echoing through the castle halls. It came quietly the way so many things in Gilles's later life would come. And once his parents disappeared from the picture of his childhood, that absence was never truly filled. The role they left behind was taken by Gilles's grandfather, a powerful, wealthy, and deeply ambitious man. He did not see in Gilles a child in need of affection. He saw an heir, a tool meant to continue and expand the family's power. Under his grandfather's guardianship, Gilles's life was planned with the precision of a long military campaign. Every step, every lesson, every relationship was calculated to serve the future of the name de Rais. The education Gilles received was not lacking in knowledge. On the contrary, it was thorough, even exceptional for the time. He learned to read and write, studied theology, law, and history. He was taught the conduct of a nobleman, how to speak to those beneath him, and how to stand tall before his equals. But in all of these lessons, one thing was absent: tenderness. Everything within the castle operated under cold discipline. Mistakes were not tolerated. Emotion was not encouraged. A child who cried or showed weakness was not seen as deserving comfort, but as deserving shame. Gilles learned very early that the world did not care about his sadness. and if he wished to survive in that world, he would have to learn how to hide whatever stirred inside him. He did not have a childhood in the ordinary sense. There were no carefree games with other children, no running through muddy fields. Gilles's world was confined within the towering stone walls of the castle, within long, frigid corridors where footsteps echoed like constant reminders that he was always being watched. Other children, if they appeared in his life at all, were the children of servants' people he was taught from the beginning to keep at a distance. The castle where Gilles grew up was beautiful. It had vast halls, stained glass windows, thick carpets, and lavish feasts. But to a child, that beauty slowly transformed into something else. It became a gilded cage, a place of safety, but also of suffocation, a place that protected, and at the same time, imprisoned. Inside that cage, Gilles always stood at the center, yet was never truly touched. Servants bowed when they spoke to him. Adults addressed him with respect, but without warmth. No one held him when he was afraid. No one knelt to meet his eyes and asked what he was thinking. Gilles was served, but rarely listened to, respected, but not understood. That loneliness did not show itself openly. Gilles learned to be quiet. He observed more than he spoke. He studied the expressions of those around him, learned to read what was never said aloud. In a world where power was the common language, he quickly understood that silence was often safer than honesty. His grandfather believed he was doing what was best for his grandson. In the mind of a medieval nobleman, forging a child through iron discipline was the only way to prepare him for a brutal world. What he failed to see or chose not to see was that every cold lesson stripped away a piece of innocence, a piece of empathy, a piece of human connection. As Gilles grew older, he became accustomed to standing alone in rooms that were too large, accustomed to thinking in silence, accustomed to expecting no comfort from anyone. And within that familiarity, something dangerous began to take shape. When a person learns to live without connection, they may also learn to act without compassion. The child growing up in the de Rais castle lacked nothing in material terms, but he lacked the gentle boundaries that only love can create. No one taught Gilles that some actions should never be taken, not because they are forbidden, but because they harm others. His world was divided cleanly into two roles, those who command and those who obey. That gilded cage protected Gilles from many dangers of ordinary life, but it also kept him from encountering the things that might have taught him the value of an ordinary human being. And when a child grows up knowing only power and loneliness, one day that emptiness will demand to be filled by means no one can foresee. This was Gilles de Rais before he became a hero. A silent, intelligent child, wrapped in power and raised in isolation. And very soon the world beyond that stone cage would call to him, not with whispers, but with the clash of steel, the roar of crowds, and the smell of blood on the battlefield. The world beyond the stone cage of the de Rais castle did not wait for Gilles in peace. It waited for him in war, and not just any war, but the 100 Years' War, one of the longest and most brutal nightmares in French history. When the call to arms echoed across the land, Gilles de Rais was still very young. But in that era, youth was not a reason to stand aside. It was an advantage. A strong body, an unbroken spirit, and a name powerful enough to secure an immediate place on the battlefield. Gilles went to war, while many of his peers were still learning how to be heirs within the safety of grand halls. He did not begin in the lowest ranks. The nom de Rais opened the way for him to step directly into command, where his orders could decide the lives and deaths of hundreds of men. For many, such responsibility would have been crushing. For Gilles, war offered something he had never known before: clarity. On the battlefield, everything was sharply defined. There were orders and obedience, enemies and allies, victory and defeat. The vague gray spaces of castle life disappeared. The complex social rules and silent judgments were gone. Here, a person's worth was measured by effectiveness. and Gilles proved disturbingly well suited to that measure. He quickly demonstrated military talent that surpassed many nobles of his time. Gilles did not rely on family reputation alone. He observed, learned, and adapted. He understood how to position troops, how to use terrain, how to strike when the enemy was weakest, and retreat when necessary. In the chaos of war, he found order. In violence, he found purpose. Discipline on the battlefield was harsh, but it was a discipline Gilles recognized. It mirrored the cold upbringing of his childhood, only now everything moved faster, more directly, without disguise. Orders were given and results followed immediately. There was no room for hesitation, no room for soft emotion. And Gilles, who had learned early how to bury his feelings, became chillingly efficient. Victory followed victory. Gilles's reputation spread through the ranks. He was spoken of as a young but uncompromising commander, a man unafraid to make hard decisions. To the soldiers under him, he was reliable. To his enemies, he was a name to fear. War, in all its cruelty, had sharpened Gilles into a precise instrument. In this environment, traits society might otherwise condemn were rewarded. Hesitation was weakness. Mercy at the wrong moment could mean disaster. Gilles has learned that winning sometimes required setting moral questions aside, and each time he did so and succeeded, that belief grew stronger. It is no accident that war is often called the forge of heroes. It creates people willing to do what others cannot. But war has another side. It normalizes violence. It transforms extreme actions into necessities. And for someone like Gilles de Rais, raised in isolation and unchecked power, war was not merely a duty. It was the perfect environment. There, Gilles did not have to face the emptiness inside him, the clash of steel, the roar of men, the relentless rhythm of battle filled every silence. He did not need to question his emotions or search for deeper meaning. Everything revolved around the next mission, the next battle, the next victory. War gave him a clear identity: warrior, commander, defender of the realm. The more Gilles fought, the more confident he became. Success on the battlefield reinforced the sense that he had been born for this, that this chaotic world only made sense when ordered through force. The cold lessons of childhood finally found their perfect application. No longer theories whispered in stone chambers, they became living reality amid fire and blood. Those around him began to see Gilles differently, not just as a young noble with powerful blood, but as a man of genuine ability. Praise followed. Recognition followed. For someone who had grown up starved of personal affirmation, this was a powerful drug. It filled part of the emptiness that had shadowed him for years, but here too something dangerous quietly took root. When a person is praised only for efficiency and victory, it becomes easy to believe that the end justifies the means. War never asked Gilles how he felt. It asked only whether he won, and so far the answer had always been yes. In the firestorm of the 100 Years' War, Gilles de Rais did more than find his role. He found a place where the darker parts of himself were not merely accepted, but encouraged. War sharpened him, granted him real power, and set him on a path toward the highest heights of fame, but it also planted a dangerous belief that violence, when cloaked in righteousness, was a legitimate tool for imposing order on the world. And very soon that order would carry Gilles de Rais closer to the center of history than anyone could have imagined. Within the storm of war, he was about to meet a person who would completely change his place in the eyes of France. A young girl bearing unshakable faith and the fate of a kingdom on her shoulders. Joan of Arc was coming. The meeting between Gilles de Rais and Joan of Arc did not unfold beneath the radiant glow of legend, as later generations would tell it. It happened in a France exhausted by war, where faith had been worn thin by years of defeat. When Joan appeared, she did not bring a mighty army or elaborate strategies. What she carried was a conviction so fierce, it left those around her both astonished and uneasy. And it was that conviction that changed everything. To Gilles, Joan of Arc was unlike anyone he had ever known. On the battlefield, He was accustomed to orders born of rank, authority, and experience. Joan possessed none of those things. All she had was a steady voice, an unshakable gaze, and an absolute certainty that God stood at her side. In a world collapsing under doubt, that kind of certainty became the most powerful weapon of all. Gilles was assigned to protect and support Joan. At first, it was simply a military order, but very quickly it became something deeper. In Joan, Gilles saw something he himself had never possessed, a purpose that transcended the self. She did not fight for glory, nor for power, nor for family legacy. She fought because she believed, truly believed, that France was meant to be saved. That belief spread. It moved through weary encampments and across faces hardened by loss. And Gilles, who had once found order in war, now found meaning. Standing beside Joan, he was no longer merely an efficient commander. He became the right hand of a symbol. His orders now carried a different weight, not only serving a strategy, but serving a mission believed to be ordained by God. Victories began to come more quickly, not because Joan's tactics were superior, but because of the spirit she inspired. Soldiers fought with renewed faith, with the sense that they were not just defending land, but participating in something greater than their own lives. Gilles stood at the heart of that wave. He commanded, he protected, and he witnessed how one human being could ignite an entire nation through pure belief. The people began to venerate Joan as a living saint, and within that radiance, Gilles was lifted as well. His image became inseparable from the young girl seen as God's messenger. In liberated cities, crowds cheered, not only when Joan appeared, but when Gilles rode beside her armor gleaming beneath the sun. To them, he was the ideal knight defender of faith and kingdom alike. Gilles's fame reached heights he had never known. He was no longer just a talented young nobleman. He became part of a legend, being written day by day. Songs were composed. Stories were passed from mouth to mouth. In the eyes of many, Gilles de Rais was not only a great warrior, but a man standing on the side of absolute good. His closeness to Joan of Arc wrapped him in a moral halo, a sacred mantle that concealed the colder edges of his nature. And Gilles believed it. He believed that what he was doing was right, that every harsh command, every ruthless decision on the battlefield was justified by the higher purpose behind it. When you stand beside someone believed to be chosen by God, it becomes easy to believe that you too are walking the righteous path. Any doubt that may have existed was quickly smothered by victory and public adoration, but light always casts a shadow, and the brighter the halo, the deeper the darkness behind it. Gilles did not see this while standing at the peak. He did not realize that absolute faith, no matter how sacred, can blur the boundary between right and wrong. When every action is said to serve God's will, very few dare to question it. In rare moments of quiet, Gilles watched Joan. He saw in her a purity and simplicity utterly opposed to the complex world of power in which he had been raised. Joan was not torn by personal ambition. She did not seek glory, and that contrast filled Gilles with both reverence and distance. He stood beside her, protected her, but could never become her. The height of glory came as victory after victory strengthened the faith of an entire nation. Gilles was praised, granted greater authority, and regarded as one of the pillars of the resistance. For a man who had grown up in loneliness, being hailed by thousands was overwhelming. It filled old voids with recognition and devotion, but moments like these never last. History rarely allows a person to remain in the light without demanding a price. Gilles de Rais stood at the summit of fame beside the greatest symbol of France in that era, and it was precisely at that height that fate began preparing the longest and most merciless fall. For sacred faith can lift a person toward the heavens, but when it collapses, it can drag everything down into the abyss. And very soon the flame that turned Joan of Arc into a legend would be extinguished. When that happened, Gilles de Rais would be forced to face a world with no guiding light left to follow. When the flames carried Joan of Arc out of this world, France did not lose only a symbol. It was left with an immense void. And within that void, those who had once stood beneath her light were forced to find a new place for themselves. Gilles de Rais, the man who had served as the maid's right hand, did not fall into obscurity. On the contrary, he was elevated higher than ever before. The king granted Gilles the title of Marshal of France. This was not merely an honorary distinction, but real authority. At an age when many nobles were still learning how to preserve their inheritance, Gilles de Rais became the youngest marshal in the nation's history, a position that placed him among those whose commands could shape the fate of entire regions. The ceremony was grand. Banners flew, church bells rang. Words of praise were proclaimed before a gathered crowd. Gilles stood there in splendid attire, metal catching the light, his expression calm, but his eyes betraying pride. He was not rewarded solely for military skill. He was rewarded for having stood in the right place at the right moment in history beside a legend. What followed were feasts that stretched late into the night. The great halls of Gilles's castles glowed with candlelight for days on end. Wine flowed freely. Musicians played until their hands ached. Tables overflowed with roasted meats, white bread, and fruits brought from far away. The guests were powerful nobles, generals, and clerics who had once bowed before Joan and now bowed before Gilles. Laughter echoed against the stone walls, yet within the noise there was something faintly unsettling. The laughter never quite reached the depths of the rooms. It rose, then faded, leaving brief pockets of silence, like hairline cracks in a flawless painting. No one spoke of it, but everyone felt it. Gilles moved through the crowd as a master of the house. He offered praise, delivered sharp remarks, and received admiration from every direction. No longer standing behind a sacred symbol, he was now the center. Every gaze turned toward him, and in that moment, Gilles felt not merely recognized, but confirmed as though his entire life, the loneliness, the war, the blood, the faith had all led inevitably to this point. His power extended far beyond the title alone. Gilles controlled vast lands, multiple castles, and entire territories. His word could open or seal a gate. It could send groups away or erase them from a region altogether. In the medieval world, this was power bordering on the absolute, and absolute power rarely invites self-reflection. The people around Gilles were no longer comrades from the battlefield. They were servants, attendants, men and women whose lives depended on his favor. No one challenged him. No one questioned him. Any whispers that existed lived only in the darkest corners of the castle and vanished the moment Gilles passed by. His pride grew not explosively, but quietly spreading like a slow shadow. Gilles began to see the world through the eyes of a man who had once believed God stood at his side. He had fought for a sacred cause. He had been praised as a knight of light. And now, even with that light gone, he still believed himself to be different, set apart. The feasts became more extravagant. Fewer private chambers, fewer were allowed to enter. Certain doors in the castle began to remain closed more often. There were no announcements, no explanations. From one day to the next, servants were no longer summoned to certain areas. When asked, they lowered their heads and said it was an order. Small details began to appear, very small ones. Servants reassigned without explanation. Objects taken away and never returned. Nights that stretched unnaturally long with candlelight burning in rooms that should have gone dark hours before. No one dared ask, and no one truly wanted the answer. At the height of his power, Gilles de Rais was no longer bound by war or by the sacred faith of Joan of Arc. He had time, he had space, and he had the authority to do whatever he wished within the thick stone walls of his castles. For a man long accustomed to discipline and command, absolute freedom did not bring peace. It opened a void. Within that void, thoughts were no longer drowned out by clashing steel or prayer. Nights grew silent, terrifyingly so. Gilles walked alone through empty corridors, the echo of his own footsteps sounding as if someone else followed close behind. He began spending more time alone, and this solitude was not the loneliness of childhood. It was heavier, denser. The summit is always the most dangerous place. There is no one above to restrain you, no one beside you to remind you. Gilles de Rais had attained everything medieval society could grant a man: fame, power, and reverence. And with it, he lost the last thing that had once kept him steady: a clear boundary. And when boundaries disappear, something inside begins to shift, slowly, quietly, not an action, but a sensation, a feeling that the rules governing others may no longer apply to you. This was not madness. It was the first deviation, subtle, almost invisible. At this point, no one called Gilles de Rais a monster. No one suspected the youngest marshal in France. He remained a hero in public memory, the man who had once stood beside Joan of Arc. History rarely announces the moment a person begins to slip beyond their own limits. It leaves only small signs, closed doors, prolonged silences, absences no one dares to name. And it is within those silences that the collapse quietly begins to take shape. The death of Joan of Arc did not strike Gilles de Rais like a bolt of lightning. It arrived slowly through whispers, through rumors passed from mouth to mouth, through hastily written letters, whose wording avoided saying too much. When the news was finally confirmed, there was no screaming, no outburst of rage. There was only a long, heavy silence, so dense that even those closest to Gilles did not know what to say. Joan of Arc, the figure who had once stood at the center of all belief, had been brought before a crowd and condemned. The accusations were spoken in the name of faith, in the name of order, in the name of the very thing she had trusted without hesitation. When the flames died out, France gained another saint in memory, but lost something far more vital: its guiding torch. For Gilles, that light was not just a national symbol. It was the only thing that had ever given him a reason beyond himself. The war, too, slowly came to an end, not with a single glorious victory, but with a shared exhaustion on all sides. Armies disbanded, fields returned to their familiar silence, swords were set aside. For many, it was a release. For Gilles de Rais, it was emptiness. With no battles left to command, and no Joan left to protect, Gilles suddenly lost the role that had defined him for years. The title of marshal remained. The power was still his. But stripped of a clear purpose, those things began to feel hollow. He no longer woke each morning to military plans, no longer faced danger on the battlefield. Instead, there were long days with nothing to fill them. Gilles withdrew from the cities and returned to his castles, massive stone structures, once synonymous with power and safety. But when he passed through their heavy gates, what greeted him was not the feeling of home. It was silent, a silence unlike that of the battlefield. Here there was no tension, no anticipation. Only time stretches outward, wide and purposeless. The familiar corridors seemed longer. Gilles' footsteps echoed and faded unanswered. Rooms that once blazed with light during feasts now fell dark earlier each evening. Servants still bowed, still performed their duties, but the distance between them and their lord felt greater than before. No one dared disturb him. No one dared ask what he was thinking. At first, Gilles tried to occupy himself with routine. He reviewed accounts, ordered repairs, hosted small gatherings, but everything ended quickly, leaving behind an even deeper sense of vacancy. Conversations felt thin. Compliments sounded identical, stripped of meaning. Without Joan, nothing carried a sacred purpose anymore. At night, the castle grew especially heavy. Wind slipped through the stone cracks, bringing damp cold with it. Candlelight cast long, warped shadows along the walls, shifting with each faint current of air. Gilles sat alone in vast rooms, staring into the space before him, not because he was thinking of something specific, but because there was nothing left to think about. The emptiness did not arrive all at once. It spread gradually, like cold seeping through armor after battle has ended. Gilles began to realize that the peace others longed for unsettled him. Quiet did not bring rest. It exposed the voids inside him that had once been masked by duty and danger. He started distancing himself from former companions. Mentions of Joan made him uneasy. Stories of the war felt like they belonged to another life. Gilles no longer wanted to be remembered as the man who had stood beside the maid. Each reminder forced him to confront the fact that her light was gone, and he did not know where to go in the darkness that remained. Small changes appeared within the castle. Daily routines grew irregular. Certain rooms were kept closed more often. Candlelight sometimes burned late into the night in places where no one expected it. When servants were asked, they answered only that it was the marshal's wish. No further explanation was given. Gilles began spending more time alone with thoughts he did not share. He read more, but not military records. He turned instead to old books, obscure manuscripts, texts that spoke of invisible worlds and laws beyond ordinary life. No one knew what he was searching for. Perhaps he did not know himself. When someone accustomed to living in the light is forced to remain in darkness, they will try to create another source of illumination, or at least something strong enough to distract them from the void. For Gilles de Rais, that void was not simple sadness. It was the feeling of being abandoned by a story he once believed he was meant to inhabit. The de Rais castle stood motionless, watching its master wander through empty corridors. The stone walls offered no response, no comfort. They only held sound breath and secrets. And within that space, Gilles began to change, not through visible actions, but through a slow shift of the mind. The light was gone. The war was over. The purpose had vanished. One by one, the forces that had kept Gilles de Rais upright fell away, leaving him alone with power time and emptiness. And history shows that very few people can endure that combination without losing themselves. At this point, there were no crimes, no accusations. Only the youngest marshal in France, returning to his castle after the war, beginning to feel something he had never learned how to face. Emptiness is not an enemy that can be defeated with steel, and when it is not filled with purpose, it will find another way to be filled. The emptiness inside Gilles de Rais did not fade with time. It did not soften or wear away. It accumulated quietly, like a room sealed for too long, where the air grows thick cold and carries the faint scent of something decomposing very slowly. Gilles began to realize that fame, once it no longer has to be earned, quickly loses its weight. The cheers that once made him feel real now echoed hollowly stripped of substance. He spent money as if gold itself had lost all meaning. The treasury was opened again and again. Ingots were carried out. Chests of silver were replaced with empty ones. Merchants from distant regions arrived bringing costly and strange goods. Fine silks rare, strong wines, intricate decorations, objects whose purposes even the sellers could not clearly explain. All were accepted. No bargaining, no hesitation. Feasts returned to Gilles's castles, but they carried a different tone. These were no longer celebrations of victory or honor. They stretched on heavy and suffocating. Candles burned through the night, thickening the air, blending heat with the sharp scent of wine. Musicians played endlessly, yet their music never seemed to reach the deeper corners of the great halls. Guests still came, at least at first. They raised their cups, laughed politely, and maintained the manners required in the presence of a powerful marshal. But as the night wore on, smiles grew strained. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. Some guests found excuses to leave earlier than planned. Those who remained avoided meeting Gilles' gaze as he silently observed them from the center of the room. Gilles was present, but never truly involved. His eyes drifted across faces without lingering. When laughter rose, he rarely joined in. When the music stopped, he showed no concern. Some nights, while the hall was still full, Gilles would abruptly stand and leave without explanation. The doors closed behind him, leaving a brief, uneasy silence, then whispers spreading softly like a ripple. Loneliness returned, but this time it was not the familiar solitude of childhood. It came with boredom and pressure. Gilles had reached every height medieval society could offer a man, and precisely because of that, nothing excited him anymore. Experiences that once quickened his pulse had become rituals endlessly repeated. Wine was no longer strong enough. Music no longer deep enough. Flattery no longer reached him. A different rhythm began to form inside the castle, discreet, gradual. Certain rooms that once drew little attention were now lit regularly at night. Doors remained closed longer than usual. The faint glow of candles behind narrow cracks became a familiar sight for those passing through dark corridors. Servants began to notice small unsettling details. Objects carried inside and never seen again. Fabrics set aside for washing at unusual hours. Buckets of water were replaced repeatedly, even when the air was cool. When questioned, the answer was always the same. It was the marshal's will. No further explanation, and no one dared ask twice. For Gilles, the feasts became a shell, a way to preserve appearances, to keep the outside world from peering too deeply beyond the stone walls. But inside the castle, silence thickened. Areas once busy grew deserted. The air there felt colder, damper, carrying a faint, unnameable odor that made people walk faster as they passed. At night, Gilles wandered alone through long corridors. Torchlight was never enough to banish the shadows in the corners. His footsteps echoed steadily, then stopped before the doors that few were permitted to open. Beyond those doors, time seemed to move differently. No one knew what took place inside, only that when Gilles emerged, his face showed no relief. Glory had once defined Gilles de Rais. It gave him position, identity, and a reason to exist. But when glory became something taken for granted, no longer fought for, it lost its power. The void it left behind could not be filled with gold or lavish feasts. Gilles began searching for a different sensation, not pleasure, no recognition, but something strong enough to break the numbness spreading within him. That search had no clear shape. It felt like a low, persistent hunger, one that familiar indulgences could not satisfy. The de Rais castle, with its thick walls and deep corridors, seemed to mirror its master's transformation. Certain doors were no longer opened during the day. Some rooms became blank spaces that no one mentioned. These things were never recorded, never explained. They simply existed quietly like hairline cracks in a surface that once appeared flawless. And within those cracks, the descent began. Not loudly, not suddenly, just the growing sense that what had once been enough for a man was no longer enough. And when that happens, a person does not turn away from the light because they wish to become darkness, but because darkness is the only place left that still promises something new. When the feasts were no longer enough to fill the void, Gilles de Rais began seeking out different kinds of people. Not the loud guests who crowded the great hall, not the nobles who came and went by ritual and obligation, but figures who arrived quietly as if they had always been there, simply waiting to be summoned. They came from many places. Some called themselves magicians. Some were disgraced scholars, carrying old books written in scripts few could read. Others said little about who they were at all, knowing only when to bow and when to remain silent. They did not enter the castle through the main gate on feast days. They arrived at dusk when mist crept along the stone road, and they left before dawn had time to break. Behind closed doors, Gilles listened to them, not like a gullible man chasing miracles, but like someone starving for a different explanation of the world. They spoke of laws hidden beneath faith and war, of forces not taught by the church, of a world governed not only by God and kings, but by older, deeper principles. Alchemy was mentioned often, not the crude fantasy of turning lead into gold whispered by merchants, but as a path of transformation. They spoke of refinement, of breaking the limits of body and mind, of reaching a higher state through methods society was not prepared to accept. These words were whispered not out of fear, but because they did not need to be heard by anyone else. Gilles did not object. He did not mock them. He listened with cold focus. In a world where he had exhausted everything permitted, what was forbidden carried a dangerous attraction. These ideas did not promise pleasure. They promised change, an escape from the feeling of being trapped inside himself. Slowly, a small circle formed around Gilles. No one called it a group. There was no name, no public oath, but everyone knew who belonged. The most loyal servants were chosen not because they were clever, but because they knew how not to ask questions. They carried objects into sealed rooms. They cleaned up after gatherings that left no obvious trace. And most importantly, they kept silent. Rituals began to appear, though no one outside that inner circle could say exactly when they started. Only that on certain nights, candles burned differently. Not in the great hall, but deep within the castle, where the stone walls were so thick no sound could escape. Strange scents drifted into the corridors, unlike church incense, unlike any familiar perfume. Servants passing through those areas lowered their heads instinctively. They walked faster. Brief guarded glances were exchanged. No one spoke aloud. But everyone understood that some doors were better left unopened and some questions better left unasked. Magic was never called by that name. It was labeled with safer words: experiments, study, natural inquiry. Yet the way these gatherings unfolded blurred the line between scholarship and ritual. Symbols were drawn on parchment and then burned. Words were spoken so softly that only those standing close could hear. And after each of these nights, the castle seemed a little quieter. Gilles no longer sought noise. He spent his time in sealed rooms where the light was never strong enough. There, he was no longer a marshal, no longer a hero. He was simply a man trying to reach something beyond the limits his life had imposed. Those around him did not address him with grand titles. They spoke in low, even tones, as if standing before something that demanded a different kind of respect. The loyal servants became bridges between two worlds within the castle. By day, they served as usual. By night, they moved through shadow, carrying objects, letters, and sometimes small packages wrapped with great care. No one asked what those packages contained. No one wanted to know. Subtle changes followed. Certain rooms were locked permanently. Some corridors were no longer lit at all. People began avoiding specific areas without needing instruction. The air there felt colder, thicker, and sometimes carried a faint metallic scent, so brief that one might wonder if it was imagined. Gilles made no declarations. He never claimed to seek power. He never said he was crossing any line. But the way he listened to whispers, the way he devoted himself to nameless rituals, revealed a belief that there were doors still unopened. And if the light of faith had abandoned him, perhaps darkness would answer instead. The whisperers in the castle promised no happiness. They promised knowledge. And to Gilles de Rais, that knowledge held a lethal allure, because it did not demand belief the way Jean once had. It demanded only that he dare to go farther than others dared. No one in the castle could say with certainty what truly happened behind the sealed doors. There was no clear evidence, no confession. Only small changes accumulate over time, and in the darkness of those nameless rites, something was being nurtured, not by cheers or blazing light, but by silence, blind loyalty, and the belief that some powers belong only to those willing to cross the line. The castle of de Rais did not resist. It stone-walled only listened, and they would remember. The stone walls of the de Rais castle kept their whispers sealed inside, but the world below was not entirely silent. In the villages at the foot of the hill, where winding dirt roads led toward the cold gray watchtowers, people began to sense a change that was hard to name. It did not arrive with alarm bells or marching soldiers. It arrived as an absence. At first, it was just one child who did not come home by nightfall. A boy was sent on a small errand, a young girl who followed a stranger promising work at the castle. Parents waited. They told themselves the child had slept at a neighbor's house and that morning would bring answers. But dawn came and the bed was still empty. Small shoes remained neatly by the door, and the first question was never spoken aloud. Days later, it happened again in another village. Then another, not all at once, not in any clear pattern, just enough to make people begin to look at one another with unease. In the evenings, As hearth fires dimmed, doors were shut earlier. Children were called inside before the sun fully disappeared. Roads that had always felt familiar now seemed longer when walked alone. Whispers came before fear had a name. They drifted through sparsely attended markets, through church services, where prayers grew longer and voices softer. Someone claimed to have seen a child walking beside a well-dressed servant. Someone else spoke of the castle gates opening at hours no one expected. Nothing was certain, but every mention of the hill came with lowered voices. Fear did not erupt. It seeped in. Habits changed without discussion. Children were no longer allowed into the fields alone. Even short trips required an adult. When strangers arrived in a village, curious glances quickly turned cautious. Promises of work, of full meals, of a better life, once welcomed, now sounded like bait. Some families dared to ask questions. Those questions usually ended in silence, because answers taken too far would brush against power. The de Rais castle was not merely a building. It was law, order, survival itself. People knew that accusations without proof would not bring justice. They would bring consequences, and proof did not exist. No confirmations, no clear traces, only empty chairs in small homes. Chairs where a child once sat at supper, small beds no longer slept in, toys left untouched. Each family carried its grief differently, quietly and alone. At church, new prayers were added. No one named what they feared. They prayed for protection for their children's safety. The priest listened, nodded, but offered no explanations. He understood that some forces could not be spoken of from the pulpit. Mothers began looking toward the castle with a mix of fear and helplessness. The high hill no longer symbolized protection. It became a shadow cast over daily life. When the wind shifted and carried cold air from that direction, people shivered without knowing why. Some families considered leaving, but leaving was not simple. Landfields and lives, bound through generations, could not be abandoned overnight, and fear does not vanish just because the place changes. It had already taken root in minds, in quiet stories told beside the fire. Children began to learn what not to ask. They sensed tension in adult faces, caught the quick looks exchanged when the road to the castle was mentioned. They learned silence earlier than they should have, and in that silence childhood grew shorter. No one dared accuse, not because they felt no pain, but because they knew their voices were too small against stone walls and powerful names. Those who spoke at all were advised to be careful to think of their families. The advice carried no cruelty, only shared fear. Above the hill, the de Rais castle stood unchanged. No outward disturbance, no soldiers mobilizing, no proclamations. Everything looked the same, and that normality made the fear deeper, because when the worst happens quietly, no one knows how to prepare. The missing children left no complete stories behind, only gaps no one wanted to stare into. Each gap was an unanswered question, and over time, those questions accumulated, forming a heavy atmosphere that settled over the land. People learned to live with fear because they had no other choice. They continued to farm, continued to pray, and continued to avoid speaking of what tightened their chests. But whenever hoofbeats sounded in the distance, whenever the castle gates opened, their eyes instinctively sought the children, because seeing them still there was enough to breathe again. In small houses, empty chairs remained. No one removed them. To do so would mean accepting something they were not ready to accept. And in that endless waiting, fear became part of life, quiet, constant, and never truly gone. Whispers, when they exist only in small kitchens and along dirt roads, can be carried away by the wind. But when they repeat for long enough, when empty chairs appear in too many homes, they begin to travel farther, not as cries for help, but as cautious concern from people who understand that some things, if not spoken at the right moment, become impossible to control. The church was the first to sense that something was wrong, not because it saw anything concrete, but because the prayers began to change. Priests in the surrounding parishes started hearing the same fear repeated again and again in confession. Hesitant phrases, eyes lowered to the floor, questions that stopped short of being fully asked. They heard the castle mentioned more often, always wrapped in caution. The church did not act hastily. It was accustomed to distinguishing between sin rumor and truth. Those sent to listen did not bring soldiers. They brought notebooks, gentle questions, and promises of anonymity. They listened far more than they spoke, and in that silence fragments began to surface. There were no direct accusations, only disturbingly similar stories. A child asked to run an errand, a promise of food, of clothing, of a better life. Then silence. The people telling these stories did not sob openly. They spoke in flat, restrained voices, as if the pain had been compressed for too long, and it was that restraint that sent a chill through those listening. The state began to take notice as well, not out of compassion, but out of concern for order. When a region sinks into fear, when people whisper about power in ways that cannot be controlled, instability follows. Officials were sent without declaring any clear purpose. They came to inspect records, to ask about taxes, to conduct business that appeared ordinary. But in private conversations, they asked other questions. Those questions did not mention Gilles de Rais, at least not yet. They circled disappearances, changes in village life, and recent irregularities. Every word was chosen carefully. A single misstep could cause doors to close forever. Power does not like to be stared at for too long. Testimonies were gathered slowly. There were no public statements, no oaths sworn before crowds, only quiet conversations in secluded places. Each person offered a fragment. No one dared tell the whole story, but when those fragments were placed side by side, they formed a shape blurred, incomplete, and deeply unsettling. Certain details are repeated. The road leading up the hill, well-dressed servants, unusual hours, doors that stayed shut. There was no physical evidence, nothing that could be laid on a table and declared a fact, but it was equally impossible to dismiss everything as a coincidence. Those conducting the inquiries understood their position well. Gilles de Rais was not a name that could be spoken lightly. He was a marshal, a nobleman, a man who had once stood beside the most sacred symbol in France. Any rumor tied to him carried the risk of shaking not just a castle, but the foundations of public belief. So they did not rush to conclusions. They recorded, compared, verified. They let time do its work. Because time, if something real was happening, would leave traces, and if not, the whispers would eventually fade on their own. Meanwhile, in the villages, people sensed a fragile shift. Not reassurance, but the feeling that someone somewhere was listening. It brought both relief and deeper fear. Because if the rumors had traveled this far, what would come next? The church and the state kept their distance. No public accusations, no official reassurances. Formal silence settled over informal noise. And within that gap, fear grew in its own way. People were no longer afraid only of what might be happening. They were afraid of what would happen if the truth came into the open. The de Rais castle remained unchanged, silent, unresponsive. To those watching closely, this was both normal and disturbing, because when power does not bother to defend itself, it is often because it believes it cannot be touched. Those gathering testimonies knew they were walking a thin line. On one side stood justice without a clear shape. On the other hand, power with history and influence. They did not know what awaited them at the end of this path. They only knew that turning back was no longer an option. And so the process began, not with drums or arrest orders, but with ink on paper, with repeated questions, with cold patience. The rumors had reached the power, and once that happens, no matter how slowly, the wheels of history begin to turn. Once the wheels of investigation began to turn, they could no longer stop in silence. Whispers were written down, scattered fragments placed side by side, and power was finally forced to respond. But that response did not come as a loud raid. It came through law, through ritual, and through fear, dressed in the robes of justice. The trial did not open as a single proceeding, but as two: one court of the church and one court of the state. Two parallel authorities, two powers that rarely stood together, now fixed their gaze on one man. That alone was extraordinary. For when both faith and secular law appear at once, the accused no longer stands before debate, but before judgment. The setting of the trial was unlike ordinary hearings. There was no noise, no curious crowd pressing in. The air was heavy, as if everyone understood that what was about to be spoken was not merely guilt, but something capable of staining an entire symbol. Cold stone walls held every sound, making each word clearer, slower, and harder to swallow. Gilles de Rais was brought before the court, not as a stranger. He was still addressed by title, still named with honorifics. And that was what made it more unsettling. A man once celebrated now stood before questions no ceremony could shield him from. The church's court focused on what could not be seen: heresy, forbidden rites, whispers of invoking forces not belonging to God. The questions were asked in low, deliberate tones, as if each word carried the weight of hell itself. Gilles listened without immediate response. His gaze was not panicked, but neither did it hold the pride it once had. The state's court followed a different path. Testimonies were read aloud. Accounts from villages, disappearances without explanation. No one shouted accusations. Everything was presented plainly, piece by piece. That very restraint chilled the room further. For when horror is recounted without emotion, it becomes harder to deny. Threats did not come as screams or raised instruments. They came as references to the methods the law permitted to extract truth. Words were chosen with care, nothing graphic, nothing theatrical, just enough for the listener to understand that silence would not last forever, and that the human body, no matter how powerful, has limits. When the word hell was spoken, it was not metaphorical. For the church, it was the place a soul would fall if truth remained unspoken. For Gilles, who had heard of heaven and hell all his life, it was no longer abstract doctrine. It was a warning that every ritual, every whisper in darkness was now being dragged into the light. The days of testimony wore on. Gilles began to change, not through outbursts, but through exhaustion. Titles no longer protected him. Past glory no longer carried weight. Caught between two systems of authority, there was no space left to stand. And then in a moment, no one dared call sudden Gilles de Rais confessed. Not with shouting, not with defiance, but in a steady low voice, as though recounting someone else's story. He acknowledged what had taken place behind closed doors. He admitted to having gone far beyond the light that once guided him. The room did not erupt. There was no great murmur. Silence stretched longer than any reaction could have, because the most frightening thing was not the confession itself, but the man who spoke it. A war hero, a marshal, a figure once held up as a symbol of courage and faith. The question was no longer whether Gilles was guilty. A heavier question emerged in the minds of those present. How could a man who once stood beside the light fall so far? And where did responsibility truly lie? With the individual who chose, or with a society that granted absolute power and then looked away? The trial became a place where not only crimes were exposed, but moral fractures as well. It forced an uncomfortable truth into view that fame is not virtue, that faith without restraint can be twisted, and that darkness does not always rise from the outcast, but can grow at the very heart of those most revered. When the proceedings closed, no one felt relieved. Justice, if it had been served, carried a bitter aftertaste. Gilles de Rais was no longer the legendary marshal of collective memory, but neither did he become a simple monster one could easily dismiss. He became a living question, a warning of what happens when power, isolation, and blind belief converge. And in that cold space, as the records were sealed, one thing became clear. This trial was not judging a man alone. It was judging the fear of an era, the fear that the line between hero and monster is far thinner than people want to believe. After the confessions were recorded, the atmosphere of the court did not grow lighter. It grew heavier, as if a door had been opened, not onto truth, but onto an even darker corridor, because the moment the final words were written down, a silent question formed in the minds of everyone present. Was that confession truly the truth, or merely the end point of a process of coercion no one wished to name? The pressure on Gilles de Rais did not come only from questions or warnings of punishment. It came from the entire system surrounding him. The church has power over the soul. The state has power over the body. These two forces rarely moved together, but when they did, very few individuals could remain standing between them. Days of questioning unfolded in enclosed spaces, under dim light, with low voices repeating the same demands. Each question did not simply seek an answer. It reminded him that silence would lead to something worse. Whispers spread that Gilles had been presented with possibilities that did not need to be described in detail. Merely naming them was enough. In an age when fear was considered a legitimate tool for uncovering truth, the line between confession and submission was dangerously thin. A person could say something not because they wished to, but because they no longer had the strength to resist. Political motives begin to surface when the broader context is examined. Gilles de Rais was not only an individual, he was a symbol, and symbols, when they become dangerous, must be handled in ways that do not destabilize the entire structure of power. A public trial with a clear confession could close the story far more efficiently than a prolonged investigation filled with uncertainty. The question of who benefits quietly emerged in private conversations. Once Gilles was condemned, his immense wealth no longer belonged to a single man. It was divided, transferred, and redistributed. Vast lands, castles, and revenues once controlled by a marshal became legitimate objects of reassignment. Power was reorganized more neatly, more safely for the existing order. The church, too, benefited differently. Condemning a powerful noble for acts labeled heretical sent a clear message. No one stood above the law of faith. No one, no matter how celebrated, could step beyond the boundary without consequence. In a world anxious about the spread of forbidden beliefs, that message carried more weight than any sermon. Yet doubts did not vanish with the verdict. They survived in the gaps of the records. Some testimonies conflicted. Some details cannot be verified. Stories were retold again and again, each time slightly altered, not necessarily because of lies, but because memory, when shaped by fear, is no longer transparent. Some believe Gilles spoke the truth, that his confession was the result of an internal collapse, when the darkness could no longer hide. But some believe he confessed to end it all to spare himself and what remained of him from a far worse fate. In this view, the confession is not raw truth, but a final choice. Those who lived near the de Rais castle would never receive a complete answer. For them, questions of political motive or legal pressure mattered less than the losses they endured. But history is not written only by the suffering of victims. It is also written by the decisions of those in power, by quiet compromises made to keep society from fracturing. And it is here that the story of Gilles de Rais becomes terrifying in a different way. Not because of what he may have done, but because we can never be entirely certain where the full truth lies. A man can be both perpetrator and instrument, both the source of horror and a sacrifice to stability. The confession preserved in written records becomes a cold document. It exists on paper, detached from voice, from expression, from the suffocating context of the room in which it was spoken. Without those elements, later readers are forced to decide what they believe. Do they trust the words themselves or the silences between the lines? No conclusion is strong enough to seal this story shut. Every generation that returns to the case of Gilles de Rais brings its own questions, its own fears. And each time, the story is retold differently, reflecting the anxieties of that era. Perhaps the most disturbing thing is not how far a person can fall, but how truth itself, when passing through power, fear, and interest, can be bent until no one dares claim they see the entire picture. And in that darkness, the confession of Gilles de Rais continues to echo, not as an answer, but as a question that has never been fully resolved. When questions still hung unanswered in the air. The wheel of judgment continued to turn. Whether the confession was the full truth or the product of unbearable pressure no longer mattered to the society of that time. What it needed was an ending, not to understand, but to close the door. And that ending took the form of death. The day of execution was not called a day of vengeance. It was called the restoration of order. From early morning, people began to gather, not with excitement, but with a mixture of emotions difficult to name. Some came out of curiosity. Some came out of fear that if they stayed away, they would miss a moment of history. Others came simply to be sure that this story would truly end. Gilles de Rais was brought out not as a hero, but not entirely as a man cast out either. There were no cheers, no roaring curses. The crowd was unnaturally silent, as if everyone understood that the man standing before them had once been a symbol of something immense, and that now that symbol was being dismantled piece by piece before their eyes. He walked slowly. He did not resist. He did not search the crowd for familiar faces. His expression no longer held the pride of a marshal, but it did not carry the panic of desperation either. It was the face of a man who had reached the end of his path, whether that path began in light or in darkness. The ritual followed its prescribed order. The words spoken were formulaic, cold, and stripped of emotion. They did not recount past glory. They did not dwell on the contested accusations. They simply confirmed that everything had been decided, and that from this moment on, there was nothing left to debate. As the final moment drew near, the silence of the crowd grew heavy enough to feel. There were no loud cries, no celebration. Only the wind moves through the air, carrying the damp smell of earth and the chill of a gray morning. Some people lowered their heads, others turned away. No one wanted to look for too long. The death of Gilles de Rais did not bring a sense of victory. It brought emptiness, because when a symbol collapses, what remains is not relief, but a hollow space where belief once lived. People did not lose only a man. They lost a familiar story of heroes and evil, of light and darkness. When it was over, the crowd dispersed more quickly than expected. No one lingered to argue loudly or reflect aloud. The roads emptied in a short time, as if everyone wanted to leave the place as soon as possible, carrying with them an unease they could not put into words. The silence that followed was more disturbing than any noise. There was no memorial, no song, no officially encouraged narrative. The name Gilles de Rais slowly vanished from public conversation, as though speaking it had become improper, a stain that might spread. The de Rais castle, once the center of power, and whispers fell into desolation. Long corridors no longer echoed with familiar footsteps. Sealed rooms remained locked. No one wished to stay there longer than necessary. The stone walls still stood, but they no longer represented safety or authority. They became mute witnesses. The fall of Gilles was not only the end of a life, it was the collapse of an image society had leaned upon. A war hero, a man who stood beside Joan of Arc, a symbol of the belief that some individuals were chosen by God. When that image shattered, people were forced to confront a more uncomfortable reality, that no armor is thick enough to fully shield the darkness within a human being. No final explanation was ever given. No conclusion is strong enough to dissolve every doubt. Death closed the legal case, but it did not close the story. It merely shifted it from the present into memory, where it continued to exist as whispers and unanswered questions. For the people, the tragedy did not end when the body of Gilles de Rais was gone. It ended when they realized the world was not as simple as they had believed. That light can fail. Those symbols can collapse. And that sometimes evil does not come from those pushed to the margins, but grows at the very heart of what was once most revered. The death of a symbol does not bring peace. It leaves behind a long silence, and within that silence, the haunting remains alive, needing no body, no title, only the memory of those who witnessed a complete and irreversible fall. After the death of Gilles de Rais, the story did not end. It simply changed shape. From sealed verdicts and a cold execution ground, it slipped into collective memory, where history and legend begin to blur, where clear boundaries no longer exist. There, Gilles was no longer a man of flesh and blood. He became a silhouette, and that silhouette shifts depending on who is looking at it. History records what it can record, dates, confessions, verdicts, but history also leaves long gaps, places where ink cannot keep pace with fear, power, and silence. It is inside those gaps that legend is born, and it is there that Gilles de Rais begins a second life, darker, more distorted, and far more elusive. Some call him a monster, a man who exploited power, faith, and darkness to commit acts beyond naming. In this version, every piece falls into place with terrifying precision. The missing children, the whispers inside the castle, the rituals no one dared witness. Gilles becomes the embodiment of the most frightening idea of all evil protected by glory and belief. But others propose a different explanation, one far less comforting, far less clean. Gilles de Rais was not only a source of fear, but also a sacrifice of his time. A man too powerful, too anomalous, too dangerous to remain, once the war was over. An old symbol that had to be destroyed, so a new order could stabilize. History has done this before, and it will do it again. When a figure grows too large, too complex, society often chooses a simpler story to tell. A monster is easier to accept than a contradiction. It allows the record to be closed without forcing anyone to look into the mirror. In this way, the story of Gilles de Rais bears an unsettling resemblance to that of Elizabeth Bathory, a powerful figure in a stone castle, surrounded by rumors, fear, and disputed testimony. A person pulled from the light of history and submerged into the darkness of legend. Both are bound to crimes that make the listener recoil, and both leave behind questions no court ever fully answered. Elizabeth Bathory became the Blood Countess. Gilles de Rais became a child killer. These titles are powerful, haunting, and far more enduring than any sentence passed in life, but they also conceal something essential. They erase context. They erase motive. They erase the role of the systems that allowed such figures to rise and then decided they had to fall. So where is the line between monster and sacrifice? When a confession is spoken under pressure, is it truth or surrender? When a society chooses silence after the death of a symbol, is it because it has been freed or because it cannot bear to face what it once enabled? If Gilles de Rais truly was a monster, then the next question is unavoidable. What created him? A child raised in isolation, a warrior shaped by violence, a man granted absolute power and then abandoned in emptiness. If he were the product of a system, where does responsibility truly lie? And if he was a scapegoat, then what truths were buried with him? What interests were preserved? What stories were simplified to make them safer? And how much of what we believe today is truth rather than the most acceptable version of it? History does not always lie, but it never tells the whole story. It selects, it arranges, and sometimes it allows legend to finish the work. Legend does not require proof. It only requires fear, and fear, as we have seen, has a very long life. The story has now been told, but the answer has not been given, and perhaps it never will be. Gilles de Rais remains suspended at the boundary between light and darkness, hero and monster, history and myth, never fully belonging to any one side. So now I want to ask you, what do you believe? Do you believe Gilles de Rais descended into the darkness of his own making? Or do you believe he was the price history paid to keep order from collapsing? Where do you stand, and why? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Because stories like this do not exist to give answers. They exist to force us to ask questions. And if you believe that these dark, ambiguous, and haunting chapters of history deserve to be remembered, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Every failure is a reason for us to keep opening doors that time has tried to lock shut. Because some stories, even centuries after they end, never truly sleep, and sometimes the most frightening thing is not what once happened in the darkness, but how close we still are to it, separated only by a different name.